There is a kind of silence over Khost that does not belong to any single hour. It rests across the valley like a film of dust, ancient, unbroken, and heavy with what it has heard. When the wind dies, even the insects pause, as if the land itself is holding its breath. The mountains that edge the horizon are jagged, pale ridges of stone that rise from an ocean of sand. They seem close enough to touch, yet unreachable, always veiled by heat and distance. In this desert, sound travels strangely. A whisper can cross a mile, but a shout disappears into nothing. They say the desert remembers everything. You can see it in the half-buried trenches left by the Soviets, in the rusted fragments of metal that still glint beneath the sun. Decades ago, engines roared here, boots struck gravel, and radio chatter filled the air. Now only the wind answers. US patrol routes crisscross the same ground, but their outposts have faded into the dunes, outlines of sand-filled bunkers and concrete skeletons. Before them, the British built stone walls that time has rounded down to faint ridges, layers of conflict pressed into the soil. Eras stacked like sediment, each whispering to the next. And yet, the quiet is too perfect. It feels designed, as though the valley were holding a secret too fragile for noise. Travelers often describe the same sensation, a pull in the air, a weight on the ears, as if sound were being drawn into the ground. You can walk for hours and hear your own heartbeat louder than your footsteps. When the wind shifts, it carries back faint patterns, echoes that do not match the direction of your voice. It's a place where echoes return before you speak, where silence bends time into a slow circle. Soldiers once joked that the ground talked back. They said if you stood still long enough, you'd hear a reply. Soft, patient, curious. Most dismissed it as fatigue or imagination, but some never laughed when they said it. The desert, after all, has seen too much to be truly empty. Beneath its quiet surface lies a memory older than the wars that crossed it, older than the men who listened for answers. In Khost, even silence seems to remember the sound of what it once buried. For generations, Khost has been a borderland of unfinished stories. Every army that passed through left something behind, not trophies or monuments, but fragments of sound that never reached home. The Soviets came first in numbers that darkened the roads, their convoys winding through dust like metallic serpents. They mapped every ridge and ravine, yet their maps never seemed to hold still. Radios crackled, coordinates drifted, and entire patrols vanished between two known points. Reports described the same anomaly, channels that went silent mid-transmission, as if the air itself had swallowed the signal. One Soviet officer wrote in his log, "We buried men, and the sand buried the sound." After the Soviets withdrew, the valley did not rest. Tribal wars and foreign interventions followed, each claiming the same hills, each hearing the same echoes. The terrain made no distinction between languages or uniforms. It mirrored back every frequency, bending radar and voice alike. In the early years of the US occupation, soldiers nicknamed the region the Valley of Swallowed Voices. They spoke it half in jest, half in recognition. Platoons reported ghost chatter, snatches of old radio calls that didn't belong to their network. When triangulated, the source often traced to no physical origin at all. The locals had their own name for it, Zaminikamosh, the silent land. They said it pulled at those who stayed too long, that men lost their sense of direction, not because of fear, but because the ground confused their sense of sound. Even helicopters flying over the ridges reported unusual distortions, the rotors echoing back in strange, delayed harmonics. The desert seemed to absorb energy, storing it like breath held beneath the surface. To outsiders, these were tactical notes, weather interference, bad equipment, stress. But to those who walked the ground, it felt older. The stillness was not absence, it was presence. Something watching, patient, indifferent to time. Every war left its imprint, a frequency, a vibration, a voice half buried in static. History kept repeating its own unfinished transmission, and somewhere beneath that sand, the valley listened. In Khost, sound itself learned how to disappear. In the early 2000s, when the dust had settled into a newer kind of war, a small US forward operating base stood on the outskirts of Khost. It was a cluster of steel huts, floodlights, and humming generators, surrounded by a desert that had already outlived too many flags. The soldiers who rotated through that post said the nights were the hardest. The air was too dry to sleep, and the silence stretched so wide that every sound, a boot scrape, a loose canteen, felt magnified. Yet sometimes, It wasn't the known sounds that kept them awake, it was the others. The first report came from a night watch rotation in late autumn. The team was monitoring comms when a faint whisper slid through the channel. Not a voice at first, more a shape of one, threaded between the static. They adjusted the dial, thinking it was interference. Then came the words, clear, brief, unmistakably human. It was a name, spoken in English, but not by anyone in their unit. The next moment, the signal was clean again. The operator logged it, ran diagnostics, and found no anomalies. The entry was filed as a momentary distortion, but the same event happened again and again. The voices were never loud, always threaded between their transmissions, as if waiting to speak when they stopped. That phrase repeated itself across multiple reports. It came between transmissions, as if waiting to speak when we stopped. One sergeant, a calm man who'd done 2 tours before, said he heard his own name in the tone of his mother's voice, even though she'd passed away years earlier. He stopped talking on the radio for a week after that. Command dismissed the incidents as fatigue, stress, or a byproduct of overlapping frequencies. They told the men that sound travels oddly in dry air, that radio echoes can rebound off the mountains. But the strangeness deepened when seismic sensors began recording rhythmic vibrations under the valley floor. The data showed a low, repetitive pulse, soft, steady, almost like breathing. It continued for hours after the base went quiet, ceasing just before dawn. Nobody mentioned it again in official briefings, but among the night watch, a quiet agreement took hold. They would keep their radios on low, never fully off, not to listen, but to let whatever was listening know they'd heard it once. The village nearest to the base was a cluster of stone homes pressed against the hills, their walls the same color as the ground. Children herded goats through dry streambeds, and old men watched the convoys pass with the same stillness they'd used to watch the Soviets decades before. To them, soldiers were not strangers, only another wind blowing through a valley that never truly changed. When asked about the hum beneath the sand, the elders offered quiet smiles, not mocking, not fearful, just knowing. One of them said that long before the wars, this place had already been full of bones. They spoke of a forgotten empire that came from the west, soldiers in bronze and leather, who marched into the desert chasing the promise of new borders. They built fires, carved wells, and vanished. No record, no return. Only their weapons were ever found, fused to the rock by heat so great it melted the edges. The villagers said the valley beneath the new base was where those men slept, that the desert there breathed differently. At night, the air would tremble against the skin, even when there was no wind. They told the soldiers that to dig too deep was to disturb the breath of the buried. Most of the Americans laughed politely, assuming it was local superstition meant to keep outsiders wary. But one interpreter, a man who'd served both armies and seen more of war than most, refused to go near the site after sunset. He said it simply, without emotion. The sand repeats what it eats. He would not translate the rest of the conversation, only shook his head and added, "It remembers everything it takes." That phrase, "what it eats," became a kind of private joke around camp. Soldiers said it when gear disappeared, when a convoy radioed once and went silent, when the ground seemed to swallow sound. Still, some noticed small things, voices echoing longer than expected, footsteps continuing a half second after the last man passed, a stillness that felt watchful. In daylight, the base looked like any other, but when the sun dropped behind the ridges and the valley cooled, the wind began to move in slow, uneven breaths, in and out, as if the land itself were alive beneath their boots, repeating quietly to itself what it had taken in. In 2014, the work began as it usually did, with measurements, permits, and the patience of machines. A NATO engineering team was cutting a logistics tunnel along the ridge, a straight line through stubborn earth. The ground looked ordinary, laminated sand, thin shale, the occasional rusted buckle rising with the shovel's bite. Then the bucket struck something that rang instead of crumbled, a dull, metallic note that travelled up the operator's arms. They cleared the face by hand and found an angled steel plate buried like a lid, its bolts frozen under a varnish of salt and time. The opening widened over 2 days. Behind the plate lay a chamber, swallowed by powder, its surfaces furred with mineral crust, as if the desert had exhaled and crystallized. The first objects were familiar to anyone who knew old field gear. A cracked headset, a length of coaxial cable, a battery stenciled with numbers from another decade. The layout suggested a listening post, improvised, temporary, easily abandoned. But the floor told a different story. Under the rust and cables, a foundation of carved stone emerged in clean lines. The tooling marks too crisp to be modern. They brought in additional sensors, seismic, magnetic, thermal. Each returned the same quiet oddity. A continuous subsonic line running through the site like a horizon the instruments could not see beyond. The technicians stood deliberately in the dust and felt it in their bones. A sound that could be felt, not heard, like a slow hand pressing on the ribs. Laptops froze. The report phrased it gently. Ambient vibration present at 13 to 17 hertz. Source undetermined. Inside the chamber, the air tasted metallic, as if stored too long. When they swept the back wall, a thin seam opened and the dust sloughed away. Behind it, stair steps dropped into a darker shaft, the edges worn smooth by something more patient than feet. The team lead, a practical captain who distrusted adjectives, wrote only, "Sub-level discovered, entry pending safety." But later, over the net, someone called it what the rest were already thinking. The pit that hums. The name settled on the site like another layer of dust and would not lift. Small failures became routine. Headlamps flickered when aimed into the sub-level, and the spare generator stuttered whenever the wind calmed. The medical officer noted elevated respiration among personnel even at rest. "No panic, no dyspnea," he wrote, "just the sense of breathing against weight." A geologist tapped the stair with a knuckle and said he could feel the stone reply. He smiled, as if the rock were performing a harmless trick. At dusk, the hum seemed nearer, not louder, but closer in the way a thought approaches. It was easy to stand there, one boot on sand and one on the cool first step, and imagine the chamber as a throat tuned to older weather. The captain logged the site as secure and scheduled a descent. The paperwork called it a structural survey. The men simply called it listening. They entered at first light, when the valley was still wrapped in its cold breath and the generators purred softly above. The air system had been flushed through the night to clear the chamber, but even so, the first man down described it as breathing someone else's air. The descent was slow, cautious. Each step sank a little in the powder that had drifted down over decades, muffling the clatter of boots and leaving only the whisper of fabric and breath through filters. The stairway curved inward, carved by deliberate hands. Light pooled faintly on the walls, revealing old markings that looked like scratches until the angles aligned and formed shapes. Mathematical, symmetrical, unreadable. At 30 feet, the tunnel widened into a circular room. It felt too still, as though the air had been weighed and set. They spoke little, only what the procedure required. "Camera on," one said. "Confirm signal." The feed blinked, steady, until a low tone slipped through the comms. It wasn't feedback, too soft, too slow, a pulse that brushed against the chest rather than the ears. Someone adjusted the gain, another ran a diagnostic. The tone remained, unchanging. The captain noted a sensation he couldn't classify. "Sound without direction," he wrote later, as if space itself had a current. The microphones caught it, a faint resonance behind every voice, like another speaker half a breath away. When the team stopped talking, the echo didn't end. It drifted on, repeating the shape of their last syllables. At the far wall, the geologist brushed away the dust and found an indentation no wider than his hand. From it came a soft, uneven murmur, layered, human in pattern but impossible to follow. "It was just sound," he said later, "but it knew we were there." The medic confirmed that heart rate spiked for 12 seconds, though none of them remembered feeling fear. What they remembered was warmth, a faint vibration through the soles of their boots, like standing near a hidden engine. They stayed 12 minutes before the captain ordered withdrawal. On the playback, the video remained clear until the last 90 seconds. Then the picture shimmered, the image doubling as if light were bending inward. The background audio, when filtered, revealed an anomaly. A melodic fragment, 8 seconds long, resembling a woman humming underwater. The pattern did not match any of their voices. The recording was sealed with the notation, "Acoustic artifact, non-harmful." But within the unit, the memory persisted. The hum followed them up the stairwell, softer with each step, until the sunlight met their visors and the weight lifted from their chests. No one mentioned what they'd heard again, though every man carried the same quiet certainty that somewhere beneath that chamber, the sound had paused only long enough for them to leave. Years later, long after the tunnel was sealed and the unit dispersed to other fronts, a set of audio files appeared in an unmarked envelope. Nothing inside but a small drive and a handwritten label, Khost, 2014. The contractor who received it had once serviced generators at the site. He waited until midnight, when the apartment and the city were equally quiet, and pressed play. The first seconds carried only room tone, then a woven murmur rose from the headphones, low as breath behind a wall. It wasn't music or radio. It sounded like patience. The opening file was a braid of voice. Several speakers overlapped in different tongues. Their words softened, as if wrapped in wet cloth. A Russian numeral surfaced, broke and sank. An English call sign snapped in half. A Pashto vowel stretched thin as wire. The rhythm suggested living mouths, though the origin registered nowhere on the band. He slowed the track by half, then half again. With each step downward, new edges appeared, pulses aligning with the cadence of distress traffic recorded in 1979, time signatures that should have wondered stayed loyal to a clock that didn't exist in the room. He ran a spectrogram to let the picture speak. On screen, the whispers rose like narrow pillars and held. Their formant patterns, the resonant traces that make a voice feel alive, stacked in regular columns. Too human to be static, too static to be human. Peaks arrived where vowels would. Harmonics gathered in soft ladders, then stilled. He sent 2 clips to a colleague who specialized in dirty signals. The reply returned at dawn. Not radio, not electrical, probably physical. The contractor isolated an 8-second fragment and looped it until the hours lost their names. Within it, he heard the suggestion of a woman humming underwater. A single coordinate digit calling and the echo answering first. The smallest intake before a sentence that never began. Whenever he paused, the aftersound stayed in the room a moment longer, like warmth lingering after the stove is off. He tried to trace the metadata and found only clean absence. He checked the directory tree and found gaps, like stairs chipped away. No source could be named. The files traveled quietly through inboxes and then thinned. The contractor kept the drive in a tin for months and told no one. Proof, he decided, was sometimes only pressure, the kind you feel on your chest when the air holds more than air. He did not think of ghosts, only of storage the earth could shape and quietly release. Listening to the last track, he wrote a single line in his notebook and closed it. The recording is patient. It knows we're here. The tapes reached her through an academic contact, labeled simply Archival Acoustic Anomalies, Khost. She was a linguist accustomed to forgotten sounds, fieldwork among dying dialects, the gentle mourning of language fading into history. The files were different. They carried no grammar, no human breath, yet something in them resisted silence. She began listening in short sessions, marking the intervals of repetition. Within hours, she noticed a rhythm almost like speech attempting form, then dissolving. It was neither code nor melody, but a constant nearness, as if the tape itself desired to be understood. She charted the frequencies. Most lay below the range of normal voice, clustered where earthquakes whisper and engines dream. The spectrogram revealed delicate harmonic ladders, unstable but intentional. She called it residual articulation, the hint of a mouth where no body remained. The sand remembers frequencies the human mind forgets, she wrote in the margin. It was meant as metaphor, though later she would wonder if it was description. After several nights of listening, her dreams began to fill with borrowed sounds. They were not nightmares, only places. A corridor with no visible walls where voices folded softly over one another. Languages she had never studied spoke through her as if she were remembering instead of inventing. In the morning, she could write down syllables, but not meanings. Some resembled archaic Persian, others fragments of radio call signs she recognized from Cold War transcripts. Each time she played the files again, new phrases surfaced in the murmur, as if her attention had become part of the signal itself. Her notes grew more reflective, less academic. These are not ghosts, she wrote, but impressions, pressure marks of communication. When enough speech has lived and died in one place, the air develops a memory. The explanation was not scientific, yet it carried a calm reason of its own. If quartz can hold an image, perhaps sand can hold a voice. If rock can store time, perhaps the ground beneath Khost had simply remembered too much. By the end of her study, she no longer searched for translation. She simply listened, letting the tones settle against her breathing until they seemed to match. What once felt like an external phenomenon began to sound like the background pulse of her own body. An echo with nowhere else to go. She concluded her final report with a single, steady line. The sand remembers. I only reminded it. The official investigations that followed avoided poetry. They spoke in the language of physics, Pressure, frequency, resonance. Yet even their restraint carried wonder. Teams from geological institutes began examining the valley's samples, describing the soil as unusually dense in quartz and feldspar, crystals capable of holding piezoelectric charge. When bombarded by vibration, explosions, engines, even sustained speech, these grains could, in theory, record microscopic stress patterns, a kind of natural phonograph etched not by a needle but by the violence of history. Over decades, heat and compression might release those patterns back into the air as faint mechanical sighs. One report compared the process to tree rings for sound. Each layer of sediment captured a season of pressure. The Soviet shells, the NATO convoys, the countless human voices echoing commands, prayers, goodbyes. Sound layers beneath sound, stacked like invisible fossils. When the desert cools after sunset, temperature shifts expand and contract the crystals, stirring those layers and freeing short bursts of their memory. Instruments sometimes catch them. Soft peaks of low frequency, the earth remembering its own noise. The theory seemed almost comforting. No ghosts, no hidden intelligence, only material physics doing what it must. Scientists found parallels in other parts of the world. Cliffs that emit murmurs after artillery fire, frozen lakes that sing when thawing. Seismic specialists called them acoustic fossils. Resonances that reappear when pressure mirrors the moment they were made. In that light, Khost was less mystery than mechanism, a wound replaying itself in sound. Yet the precision unsettled even those explaining it. The frequencies recovered from the valley aligned not with random static, but with the cadence of human speech. Pauses, inflections, breaths, too structured to dismiss, too blurred to decode, as if the recording medium had learned the rhythm of its makers, but not their words. One physicist likened it to a drumhead still trembling after the player has left the room. The ground, he wrote, is the last listener. They concluded with caution. The phenomenon is rare, but not impossible. Under the right conditions, a landscape can behave like memory, storing energy, releasing fragments when touched by time. The explanation satisfied most readers. Still, those who had stood in the pit said that reason never quite erased the feeling. Logic described the mechanism, but not the moment when the sound seems to lean toward you, as though remembering isn't the same as letting go. Not everyone accepted the idea of stones replaying sound. In the villages near Khost, people spoke of the phenomenon without diagrams or data. To them it was simpler. The voices belonged to those who had never left. The desert, they said, keeps its promises. A local imam, who had buried 3 generations of soldiers along the same ridge, put it in one sentence. When men die speaking, the earth repeats their words. He said it quietly, not as doctrine but as observation. The others in the courtyard nodded as if it were weather, an expected truth that required no argument. In this version, every war layered its own choir beneath the sand. The Persians, the British, the Soviets, the Americans, each left behind fragments of breath. Not ghosts, but continuations. The air thickens, they said, with memory until it begins to answer. Those who have heard the valley at night claim the sound isn't mournful. It is steady, patient, more like prayer. The earth repeats not to haunt, but to remember what words once meant before they were lost to command or fear. Travelers sometimes pause at dusk near the old base. They describe the wind lowering in pitch, a hum that vibrates against the chest. Some kneel and press a palm to the ground, feeling warmth long after the sun has gone. The villagers call this the second listening, the moment when the land listens back. One elder told a visiting journalist, "It does not want attention, it only wants to continue speaking." When asked what it says, he smiled. It says what it was told. It says everything again. Scholars hearing such accounts labelled them metaphor, a cultural way of reconciling loss. Yet there is something persuasive in a faith that doesn't demand belief. The imam's phrase, "the earth repeats," lingers like a refrain that belongs equally to science and spirit. Perhaps repetition is a kind of mercy, allowing what was spoken in fear to be returned in calm. Perhaps memory itself is not held by the living, but by the matter beneath them, endlessly sifting the voices it was asked to keep. No conclusion ever settled the debate. The engineers spoke of minerals, the villagers spoke of souls. Between them stretched the same silence the soldiers once feared to name. And in that silence, faint but constant, the valley continued doing what both sides described in their own way. The earth repeats. Years later, I went back to Khost. The road from the border was smoother now, paved in places that once rattled every bone. The desert looked the same, but quieter, as if time had thickened the air. The outpost was gone. Only the faint geometry of its foundations remained, edges softened by wind. The tunnel entrance had been sealed with concrete, its coordinates erased from maps. Yet as I stepped down from the vehicle, the silence that met me was the same one I remembered. Dense, deliberate, waiting. It was the kind of silence that doesn't arrive. It stays, patient, until you return to it. The sand had reclaimed everything. Where the barracks once stood, small dunes had formed, their surfaces combed smooth by wind that seemed to blow without sound. I walked to where the pit had opened, tracing its position by memory, and stood until the light began to lower. The hum was gone, or perhaps it had moved deeper, beyond the reach of human hearing. Still, the air carried something, an uneven texture that brushed the skin like breath. When I closed my eyes, I could almost hear it inhaling, exhaling, content to remain unseen. I thought of the voices, the data, the endless reports trying to measure what the desert already understood. Perhaps the hum was not a phenomenon but a reminder that silence itself is an archive. The soldiers, the scientists, the villagers, all had given it words, and it had kept them in its own way. Standing there, I imagined those words pressed into the grains beneath my feet, compressed into quiet until they were indistinguishable from stillness. At dusk, the horizon turned to ash and gold. The last light slid down the mountains and scattered across the valley floor. The wind began to move again, soft, circular, touching the ground and lifting only what it needed. I listened for the hum, not expecting to find it, but hoping the air might still remember how it once sounded. What came instead was a long, slow rhythm, my own heartbeat, returning the silence in kind. Some places speak once, and once is enough. As I left, the desert faded behind me, returning to its steady, unbroken breath. The road bent, the ridges dimmed, and the sound of the engine folded into the larger hush. In the rearview mirror, the sand shimmered where the base had been. No trace of metal or wire, only light and distance. I thought then that maybe the miracle was never in the voices, but in the pause that followed them, the space where nothing more needed to be said. If you listen long enough, silence tells you what it took to stay silent.